you had the chance to totally run a country? Don't tell me you've never thought about it. Imagine it in your mind. Total control. No barriers, no elections. You snap your fingers and the policy's in place. The world is so chaotic and slow. Committees toil away at efforts that are stymied and sluggish. In my hometown, it takes 4 years to get a road remodeled. If you were making all decisions, surely everything would be more efficient. You could use science and reasoning to put everyone on the path to a golden age. Wouldn't you be great at it? Well, statistically, you wouldn't be. You'll probably usher in a mess far greater than the one you found. We don't have a lot of samples for this, but that's certainly what happened to Mao Zedong. Hello and welcome to No One is Competent, a show dedicated to convincing you that everyone who ever had any power in history was terrible wielding it. I am your first host, Azalea, also known as Wyatt, the brilliant, the flashy, the often drunk, and I'm here with my co-host, the hero that pulls it all together.
Hi, yes, yeah, that would be me, Jay.
One of these days, I won't have to edit out the pause between when I cue him up and Jay comes on, but today is not that day.
That'll be, maybe when we get into the triple digits, perhaps.
You know, I do, label these episodes. This is episode 007. This is not episode 7. It's 007. And you know why I do that? It's aspirational. You gotta believe in yourself.
Yeah, well, it's not 007 on Spotify or Apple.
Yeah, but that's because you control that, and you have no self-respect.
Indeed.
Frankly, I should start labeling them 000 number.
Yeah. Start adding decimal points afterwards, too.
No, we could do, the till death do us blurt thing, where, we appoint a successor. So, when I get shot in a shootout and die in combat with the FTC, I can have an heir who takes my place on the podcast and podcast with you. And, when you die in an opiate overdose as you successfully end life as your organs are failing at the age of 137, your successor can pass on to do the podcast.
I feel like eventually we'll just start switching to, episode 13 plus 1 and whatnot. 13 plus 1.11.
No, Jay, I already had the Ava reference lined up for this podcast. You can't subsume my plans. Okay. This is the part of the podcast where we do banter. I'm Azalea, that's Jay. We are on Twitter. I'm at Azalea Wyatt. Jay is at Harry's48. I have a YouTube channel called Wyatt the Word Weaver that there will be posts on eventually if I'm not too depressed or technology broken to do it, which occasionally happens. Our music on the show is by the legendary Sam Bryce, and you can help out the No One is Competent podcast by rating us on whatever podcast app, platform, thingamajiggery that you're on. Leave us a review, tell your friends about it, that helps the algorithm. If you're on YouTube, like, comment, and subscribe, and do not ring that bell. Have some self-respect.
I ring the bell sometimes.
My point exactly. Anyway. And if you're a super mega ultra didgeridoo fan, maybe do it on multiple platforms, because we're a new show that's really awful at branding and self-promotion and could really use... Wait, Jay, doesn't the podcast itself also have a Twitter? We should post more on that.
We should, yes. We do have a Twitter. That would be at not_competence.
Yes, at not_competent is a great way to reach out and find us if you'd like to talk to us or, scream at us at how anti-revolutionary we are. That's probably going to happen after this episode.
I do hope we get a few tanky listeners just to give us their thoughts so I can block them.
You know, we actually did not plan to do another here's obscenely horrific thing that the communists did episode. We were going to do an episode about the failures of American banking in the 19th century, but that turned out to be very boring, and also it was based off this all bunch of stuff I learned in A-Push, and A-Push lies. So we had to scrap that and do this, which is why this episode is going to be the best episode, because it's the one that I had the least involved in planning or executing.
And I made in like 2 days.
You gotta upsell yourself, Jay. You gotta be like, no, this sprang forth directly from my brilliance into your ears.
Well, more or less happened along those lines, I suppose.
How you been doing, Jay? How's life?
Doing all right. Doing well enough. Got kind of hit by the COVID vaccine, the booster shot I took last week, but after that, I'm doing fine. Now up to 20 Gs.
I don't know if I'll I don't know if a booster shot's really in my future. Like, I mean, I'm not even at 18 month at the 8-month mark to get it, and like, I mean, I didn't get. You got asthma, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's logical, but like, you know, I didn't get the COVID shot for my health. I got the COVID shot to protect the people around me. And my loved ones. And at this point, I'm pretty, you know, I'm just kind of. Listen, if I die, I die. You know, the point of this podcast is to piss someone off enough that they come to my house and I die in single combat in front of my lawn the way God intended.
So we got to do that Jackson episode eventually, and can bring back dueling as a sport.
What? Why is dueling not legal? Like, okay, I should be able to sign a piece of paper if two consenting adults want to beat the shit out of each other or shoot the shit out of each other and stab the shit out of each other, they should be allowed to do that. Like, it's madness.
Okay, Aaron Burr.
Listen. Aaron Burr no, he didn't. You haven't even seen Hamilton.
No, I've not seen Hamilton, but Aaron Burr is not a Hamilton original character, believe it or not. He does come from actual history.
That's just hypothetical. Okay, we'll get into more life stuff in episode 8. I feel like we've how long have we been shooting the breeze? Too long. The people want content. We need to inject content directly into their veins. We gotta be that IV podcast drip. Wait, drip means clothing now. When did that happen? Why is it like you've got style dripping off of you?
Yeah, so you got the drip.
Don't pretend to be hip with the kids, Jay. You the last time you spoke to teenagers was like 2012.
I spoke to a teenager like 2 months ago about anime.
All right. What's the subject of today's podcast?
Well, today we'll be talking about everybody's favorite economic development program, the Chinese Great Leap Forward.
And when did the Great Leap Forward occur? What year are we doing this?
So the Great Leap Forward itself began in 1958, and so we'll be talking about the years shortly before and after that.
So to do this, we must first ask the question, what is China?
No, we don't.
Huh?
The last time we did this, we basically ended up in an argument that almost ended the podcast, so I think we'll save our lesson on Chinese history for another time.
Okay, yes. We're not going to give you a rundown of all of Chinese dynasties and whatnot like we did with Japan, because China is even older and even harder. I will say, if you want to, like, memorize super easy the main Chinese dynasties. You just need to sing it to the tune of Frere Jacques. It's a super easy mnemonic. So you just go Shang Zhou Qin Han Sui Tang Song Wan Ming Qing Republic Mao Zedong. Easy. Were you not taught that in school, Jay?
I was not actually, no.
Okay, so here are the bare bones of what you need to know about China. China is like the state in history. It is the civilization. It's kind of like the best example of one contiguous society we have outside of maybe arguably Egypt. And even then, Egypt kind of burned itself out and just got swallowed by the Greeks and then everybody else. But China, sometimes it fell apart. Sometimes there were periods of less of disaggregated control. But it was mostly one thing for 3,000 years, more than 3,000 years, a long time. Okay, you had a series of dynasties. You've heard of this, Ming, Han, Qing, whatever. And this system is built, and this system is used to build a, for the time, very centralized state of a large military, and also a big religious background that kind of justifies why the emperor is in charge. This is called the Mandate of Heaven. You'll learn that in your A-push test. Don't worry about it. All you need to know is that this system churns on for longer than anyone's grandfather's 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 grandfather could possibly remember, until suddenly, in the early 20th century, it just stops. The Qing dynasty ends with the abdication of the last emperor in 1912. And suddenly, China is a new thing.
Yeah, and the subsequent years would see violence break out throughout the country as various political movements and warlords jockeyed for power, culminating ultimately in the Chinese Civil War fought between the nationalist Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists led by Mao Zedong.
This is a very interesting war that we will probably cover at some point in the history of this podcast. There's a lot of really important things you need to know about it. But for now, let's just say this war gets interrupted by the Japanese invasion of China in 1937. Well, Greater China, they had already invaded part of China. And by the way, side note, this is the start of World War II, and anyone who tells you that World War II starts in 1939 is a Eurocentric dumbass. So the Japanese invade. They do arguably the most horrific war crimes in the history of anything. And this, makes the nationalists and the communists, be like, is like Optimus Prime and Galvatron when Unicron show up. You're like, well, we gotta gack that guy. So they gack that guy, and World War II famously ends in 1945 with fun times for everyone. But on the other side of World War II, the communists actually find themselves in a stronger position than when they started.
Yeah, most of the best formations in the nationalist army had just been devastated by the Japanese in the years of conflict. And because of that, the communists are able to win the Civil War in a matter of a few short years. And by 1949, the communists had solidified their control over most of China, pushing the nationalists off of the mainland into their remaining stronghold of Taiwan. This meant that the communists were now faced with the task of governing and rebuilding a country that had been in a near constant state of war for the past 4 decades.
So, let's pause for a second and look at just the lay of the land if you're the leaders of China in 1949. We now know that the Cold War ended in American victory, But right after World War II, it was not clear that America was a superior, richer, more militarily powerful country than the USSR. In fact, there were very good arguments to be made that the USSR was the more dominant and the more successful economic system, regardless of what you think about communism and capitalism. The Chinese are communists. We might talk later a little bit about why they were, but they are. And they want to compete with the West and also kind of become equals with their big brother, the USSR, which they're on pretty good terms with at this point.
Yes.
And a communist society, hypothetically, you can have guys at the top just tell everybody what to do. That's all the way down to the small village level. One thing that's been kind of coming up recently on our podcast is the nature between, like, polities, names on a map, and hard nation states. And the way I see it, you're a hard nation state when you can influence just what a village of 200 people living in the middle of the mountains does. And Mao Zedong's communist Chinese government is certainly interested in doing that. They're interested into building China into an industrial mecca. They look at the USSR and the United States, and they see mass prosperity through mechanized farming, giant cities, bustling commerce, tons of trade. They want that for their people, especially a people that have spent the last half century in starvation and war, cities and towns burned to the ground. There's got to be several periods of famines and whatnot.
Oh yeah, no, there are multiple small famines throughout the entire first half of the 20th century in China. It's certainly not something new to the country. To elaborate a little bit just on the state China was in 1949, tens of millions of Chinese soldiers and civilians had been killed during the Civil War and the war against Japan. China's infrastructure was in shambles, as many of the roads, railroads, dams, and factories that had been built in the early 20th century were subsequently destroyed in the various wars. The consequence of all this chaos is that China never had the time to fully industrialize. China in the 1950s was still a highly agrarian society, with about 80% of the population living in rural areas, the vast majority of which were engaged in subsistence farming. There was some cash crops going on, stuff such as tea and cotton, but that was very small scale.
So, I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to this podcast are, gnashing their teeth and licking their lips waiting to hear about how communism is so awful and ruined all of these people's lives. But these people's lives were already ruined, okay? Them and their parents and probably their grandparents really knew only war and a shambling state, before all the wars broke out. It's not like the Chinese Republic and the shambling mess of the Qing dynasty were able to do much for the people, right? Like, China's been in heavy decline for over 100 years. And if people from the party show up and tell you we have a better way, I would trust them, because at this point you'd be willing to do anything. And if you are a communist nation who wants to improve your country, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to follow Big Brother, the USSR, and you're going to model your kind of economic improvements and systematic plans after what the USSR does, which is to implement 5-year plans. Jay, give me a groundwork idea. Obviously, a 5-year plan is a plan that lasts 5 years. But what exactly, how does this work in practice?
So the 5-year plans were official documents covering all aspects of development, industrial, agricultural, and even social, that would set guidelines to be implemented by the institutions of the state. And this was a concept that originated in the Soviet Union, And given the close relations between the Soviets and the Chinese Communists, it should be no surprise that Mao's first 5-year plan, which began in 1953, was designed along Soviet lines.
So are they just kind of like, all right, we're producing like 15,000 tons of rice this year. In 5 years, we want to be producing 150 pounds of rice.
That definitely was a part of it, but they also went into more specifics onto how to, boost their output. The first 5-year plan in particular placed a large emphasis on the construction of large factories and heavy industry in China's cities. This is something which is very much based on the Soviet model, where industrialization and, a new industrial revolution along European lines requires more urbanization. So that was really core to the first 5-year plan. It also had guidelines regarding agriculture. Cooperative farming practices were encouraged in the countryside, but at this point they were not being strongly imposed by the central government.
So would it be fair to say that, these small bumfuck middle of the nowhere villages, are they living like massively different than they were 1,500 years ago?
Not particularly. Some of the wealthier landowners and both peasants who had managed to accrue a greater degree of wealth, as well as landlords, did have their holdings split up once the communists came into power and their land redistributed. However, for most peasants, you were basically doing what your family had been doing for generations, assuming that you were lucky enough to survive the wars, of course.
So your average peasant is farming just like a few acres of land each.
Yeah, and, cooperating with other members of their village and sharing resources and pooling their knowledge, which is common for how agrarian societies work across the world.
But fundamentally, this is still very different to, like, if you just time traveled 2,000 years back, just like maybe be decently less efficient.
Yes.
The first 5-year plan works a little bit, but maybe they had overshot. Maybe some things come up, but they didn't fully meet their goals. A big choke point is that the countryside is really not providing enough food to support the urban meccas that the Chinese want to set up. So this is kind of maybe a joke, but a really rough, like if you want like the roughest, crudest way to measure how advanced your country or society is, a quick, easy way to do that is like what percentage of your population farms for a living? How many people make the food? In America, it's less than 1% right now because one person can, because one person can with tractors and pesticides and fertilizers and crop dusting produce an utterly obscene amount of calories that we can all enjoy as we do our much more important jobs of podcasting.
Yeah, the more food you can make with the less manpower requirements, the more people can specialize into the various industrial roles that the Chinese government wants of them, and what's necessary to bring about an industrial revolution.
So, it's time to do something a little more drastic with the second 5-year plan. As we stand in 53, 54, the people in charge of China are like, all right, that was okay, but we really need to take some major steps. We need to take some big strides. We need to take a great leap forward. And I say people in charge of the Chinese state, but really it's one guy, which is why we need to spend a bit of time talking about Mao Zedong. And by me, I mean Jay, because I know nothing about this guy. Jay studied this stuff in college.
Yes. Now, Mao was born in 1893 to a wealthy peasant family in Hunan province, and his family's money allowed him to be exposed to political, philosophical, and historical literature from a young age. The Xinhai Revolution of 1911, which saw the fall of the monarchy and the formation of the Republic of China, was an inspiration for students across the country, including Mao. Mao, like so many other people, ended up turning to communism as a university student in the 1910s, and he would go on to become one of the key members, though not the leader, of the newly formed Chinese Communist Party in 1921. And he was pretty soon tasked with the job of raising and organizing militia forces for the communists, and later the KMT during their brief alliance in the 20s.
Quick, what's the KMT?
The KMT are the Kuomintang. That's Chiang Kai-shek's guys.
The nationalists.
Yes, yeah. They had a brief alliance, basically because they both wanted to get rid of the warlords.
Okay, so Mao and the KMT are fighting the warlords in 1924. Eventually, things go bad, and the nationalists turn on the communists in 1927. This sparks the Chinese Civil War, and this is around the time when Mao really takes a leadership role in the Communist Party.
Yes, he would become one of the founders of the Jiangxi Soviet, which was basically a breakaway territory controlled by communists in southern China. Now, the Jiangxi Soviet was overrun by the Nationalist Army in 1934, and that would spark an event that would go on to really define the rest of Mao's life, that being the Long March. Now, the Long March, as its name implies, consisted of Mao leading his men from the Jiangxi Soviet on the Long March through the Chinese countryside all the way to the north, where the communists had their strongholds. While only a tenth of the forces that left Jiangxi would arrive in the north a year later, Mao's ability to defy nationalist encirclement and lead his men through the trials and hardships of the Long March made him a legend in the Communist Party, which would go on to appoint him as the overall commander of all communist military forces in 1935. And many of Mao's key supporters for the rest of his life would be people who were with him on the march.
I had heard a bit of the Long March. I never knew exactly what it was. And describing it, this sounds not dissimilar to the role of, say, George Washington during the winter in Valley Forge, right? This key time where the army is stretched thin and near a breaking point, and a heavy, charismatic leader does what needs to be done to pull everyone together and becomes this legendary nationalist figure because of it. Mao... So it's going to become very important later, how scientifically literate Mao is. But remember, he does come from a wealthy family. He did get some education. But mainly, the thing this guy is good at is inspiring people. I imagine he's a good speech maker. I imagine he's got a very hearty handshake. And but he's a warrior, right? He's a general. He's really good at leading wars.
Very much so. And to go along with that, he was a strong believer in the power of mass mobilization. China lacked the industrial proletariat that was said by Marx to be necessary for communism. And because of that, Mao and his followers would formulate a new theory in which the peasantry would be the vanguard of the revolution. If you've ever heard anybody.
I've been learning a bit about the formations of communism through Mike Duncan's series on the Russian Revolution, and it might not sound to y'all who cares where the revolution comes from and what class is the revolutionary class, but no. To these people, whether or not it was going to be the peasants or the industrial workers was hours upon days of meetings and screaming matches and newspaper opinion editorials and pamphlets and books over and over, going back decades.
Yeah, it's communist debate and communist arguments are their own entertaining genre, I suppose.
I do appreciate how catty a lot of them are.
That is one of the appeals, I'm sure. And going back to Mao himself, the long march and his subsequent experiences as a leader of communist forces during the war reinforced his beliefs. The idea that the common people, united by a cause and ideology and under a common leadership, could seemingly achieve anything.
The rest of this episode is going to make Mao look very, very dumb. But he was very, very good at what he did at first. And he succeeded against obscene odds against the greatest empire that the East had ever known. Like, pushing back the Chinese and the nationalists, who again, before the war, were utterly whooping the communists. Everything he's done so far has not only succeeded, but it's succeeded widely past what anyone could have expected him to do.
Yeah, nobody expected the communists to win the Civil War so quickly in the late 1940s. The Soviets didn't expect it. The Soviets wanted, Mao to make some sort of deal with the nationalists. Maybe you could have a partitioned country, like in Korea. They didn't think that he could win so decisively.
And that's a great point. Right after that, the Korean War happens, in which the Chinese state goes up against America and does pretty well.
Yeah.
Man, taking a look at Chinese history in the 20th century is just a headache. There's too much. It is just crowded.
Yes.
There's so much. When we were putting together the outline for this episode, I was just like, wait, doesn't the Korean War happen in all this?
It does, yeah. that does occur.
By the way, just to get y'all hyped, when we first came up with the idea for this podcast, MacArthur and the Korean War was near the top of our list for big things to do.
Oh man, MacArthur is a big fish. I'm sure we'll get to eventually.
Don't y'all worry. We know, and we are licking our lips.
Indeed.
So Mao, he's this military leader, he's this commander, and as he comes into his own as the leader of the party, he grows to distrust bureaucrats and scientists, seeing them as detached from the peasantry and prone to elitism and, anti-revolutionary right-wing sentiment. And remember, if you're, a guy who's been fighting a civil war for over 10 years, right-wing anti-revolutionary sentiment equates to millions more people dying. So this could sound of the paranoia of a PTSD-ridden aging man, but, not the stupidest thing in the world. I'm really trying to be empathetic here. I think empathy, and for the people who are going to say I'm letting Mao off easy, empathy is how you understand history. It's how you understand, why things happened rather that things happen. Okay? And it's worth noting that a lot of these bureaucrats and scientists, you kind of were the people raising their hands in the back of the meeting Comrade Chairman, these sort of lofty goals, we don't really know if we can increase rice production this much, or, we don't know if this amount of railway construction is really feasible. And this, of course, Mao takes as a personal attack on his intelligence and leadership ability. Mao aims to become China on a certain level. He aims to be more of an avatar of China than the old emperors ever would. He would eventually put out a book of his sayings that everyone would have to memorize, and the state comes to almost worship him. He is China, and if China fails, he fails. And it can't, because he is not a failure. He just won the war. He's great. Everything he's ever tried to do, it has gone spectacularly. And how dare you possibly question my brilliance?
And just to clarify his actual power within China, he became the chairman of the Communist Party by 1943. And by the 50s, he was not only the chairman of the party, but also the chairman of the Military Commission and the Central People's Government, which gave him direct control over both the civilian and military organs of the state.
So practically, he can now make laws by fiat, and he is the commander-in-chief of the military.
Yes. Now, the Chinese state as a whole did allow for a greater degree of freedom of speech in the mid-1950s. They were encouraged by similar policies in the Soviet Union under Khrushchev. However, they would come to reverse course in 1957, spooked by Khrushchev's denunciation of the Stalin-era cult of personality, something which Mao was quite a big fan of, and the threat of uprising. Mao launched what would be known as the anti-rightist campaign in 1957, declaring that 5% of the country were rightists, enemies of the revolution, and tasking local leaders with rooting out those 5%.
And he just says this is true. There's no evidence. There's no.
Yeah,
he
it's no
just
study.
like thinks. He probably just studies. Your studies. I know the people. 5% of them surely aren't loyal to me. And this I want to take a little bit of a divergence and talk about like how these so-called rightists get Jay, can we talk about the self-criticism?
We can talk about self-criticism, yes.
Okay. All right. I've been studying a lot of cults recently. And Jay, have you ever heard of The Game?
No.
Okay, so The Game, I forget who invented it. Some guy in California in like the 40s or something during an AA meeting. You know, where all the best things get invented. To be clear, I say invented, but that's like he just called it The Game. But this is a thing that like totalizing societies. Okay, so when you're like in a closed circuit, say a prison or like if you live like a boarding school or a military installation, somewhere where like your job, your recreation and your sleeping quarters are like you never leave this one. We call that a totalizing institution, okay? And these are breeding grounds for cults. You may have noticed I just described a small rural village. And when these totalizing institutions, which to be clear, can be perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with a totalizing institution. In fact, I wouldn't mind living in one if it was really cool. I'm a big commune boy. I think that sounds pretty dope. I don't like driving places. When they get ideologically charged and a little paranoid, they tend to do this thing. And by the way, you'll see The Game echo. If you ever heard of Keith Raniere's cult NXIVM that was broken up just a few years ago, that had some celebrity women in it, it shows up there. It shows up in tons of Christian cult movements. And basically The Game, or self-criticism sessions, is kind of this thing where everyone sort of sits in a circle, or they're on the floor, or whatever. Just know that more or less everyone's involved. And someone is singled out. And this is generally led by a leader, but people in the group of hypothetically the same social status as the person who's singled out are encouraged to basically like mock and say everything wrong with that person. Like, Betsy, you're lazy. You're never doing enough work. And you're fucking ugly too. You are a fucking shithead. Why don't you just go fucking kill yourself? No one likes you here. And suddenly you're just being bombarded by tons of criticism and this is emotionally wretching. Often very vile cursing is a big part of this to kind of shock the system. And this achieves what we in the business refer to as emotional override, where a person, whether or not these criticisms are justified or not, will kind of like give in and and relent. And this sort of allows them to be kind of rebuilt by the group. And this is how you sort of form people who are very dedicated to a single ideology and who are also very paranoid of the other people in the group turning on them because no one wants to be the subject of a self-criticism session.
These self-criticism sessions, which were called struggle sessions in China, were a big part of the Chinese Communist Party's control over their people.
Yeah, so, like, a thing that'll happen is, and the reason I bring up cults is not to say that, like, cults influenced the Chinese, like, all the way a different ocean. It just, like, people aren't that different. People will often come up with the same things when tasked with certain goals. So, for instance, the village is told, there's 200 of us, 5%, so that's 10 of us are right-wing anti-revolutionary curs. Who is it? Well, the people who it's going to be is probably people who weren't liked to begin with. Maybe people who were uppity or problems, maybe the mentally disabled or the gossip mongers, the vulnerable.
Millions of these suspected rightists were killed, imprisoned, forced to work hard labor, or made into social outcasts. Now, at this point, most of the ones who were actually executed would have been intellectuals and the elite, people who were dangerous. Everyday farmers in random villages, they usually wouldn't face too harsh of a punishment. The result of all this was a widespread reluctance to be seen as anything but utterly supportive of the state, especially amongst those intellectuals and the elite of Chinese society.
This is going to be really important because the Great Leap Forward is going to involve a lot of agriculture. And agriculture and the study of which, along with astrology, is like kind of where all science comes from. People have been figuring out how to grow better crops and get more food so they don't die for, 8,000, 10,000 years now?
Something like that.
There are a lot of people and a lot of thoughts on how to grow crops better, and a lot of people who are wrong about how to grow crops better. But if the people who are wrong are the same people who can shoot you for disagreeing with them... As we spoke before, these peasant villages, they're being told certain things, but, like, when the party comes in and says 5% of y'all are communists, the party isn't doing it themselves. It's kind of still left up to the villagers to do it. Village elders and in the informal way they rule themselves, they're still kind of all doing this, and things have changed a little bit. But again, fundamentally, village life does not look massively different than it did 500 years ago. The Great Leap Forward is a plan to basically change that, to unite all of Chinese communism into one collective action, to fully channel the power of the peasantry to a glorious action. This is why you need a patriotic, inspiring name, the Great Leap Forward. Mao is a master of propaganda. He's a master of making people feel like they're part of a unit. I don't know how literate these Chinese peasants were. I don't know how much communist theory they'd been given. Surely some at this point. But, like, if your daddy's daddy was a subsistence farmer and someone comes up and says, hey, listen, we're going to be able to produce so much rice in a year that we won't have to work for, like, the rest of our lives after that, you're going to take him up on that deal. Which, by the way, that might have sounded like super fantastical, but Jay, could you give us a few examples about fully automated luxury communism?
Yeah, no, that's not too far from the truth. The general idea was that, if this worked out, they would massively be able to decrease the just the everyday hardship of the Chinese people. There were promises that you would have wheat fields that will grow so dense that you could walk on top of them. And that you have crops which could survive any winter, and that all these things would happen if you just got behind the program.
Yeah, and they planned for this. They did things like, hey, we quintuple, once we times 50 the amount of food we have, pests are going to be a massive problem. So we have to dedicate like a few days out of the year to killing all of the bugs and sparrows. And peasants went out and did this. Hopefully not very effectively. I do like sparrows. They did things like there are reports of villages eating 6 months worth of food stores in a matter of a few weeks because we're not going to need food stores when we have so much. It is utterly abundant. Put a pin in that. That would become a
Yeah, I think
problem.
we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, considering that we've not actually introduced the Great Leap Forward yet, really.
Okay, Jay, introduce the Great Leap Forward then.
Now, with the first 5-year plan reaching its end, Mao would reveal the second 5-year plan in January 1958, giving it this patriotic name we've talked so much about, the Great Leap Forward. The goal of the Great Leap Forward was to use the power of mass mobilization and decentralized leadership to increase agricultural and industrial productivity beyond what had been achieved by the previous Soviet-based programs. And key to the Great Leap Forward was the reorganization of the countryside into the people's communes. The people's communes were units that functioned both as local governments, akin to townships or counties, as well as units of production. Each commune would consist of between 5,000 and 20,000 households, making them vastly larger than the cooperative farms that preceded them. And all private property and land ownership was abolished in the communes. The people were encouraged, in some cases required, to live and work communally. Grain would be collected by the leaders and distributed out in communal kitchens. Young children and the elderly were put in the care of commune-run centers to give the people more time to work. And just the idea is it's almost like a military camp or utopian society, which is how it's portrayed. Everybody coming together to care for each other and work for each other.
And there's a lot of this that sounds really good, right? Like, for example, communal raising of children. And in general, larger plots of land are, one 20-acre farm is generally more efficient than 21-acre farms. There's a lot of good ideas in it, but I want y'all to remember that whole food is going to be taken up from everyone and then redistributed part.
Yes, that will become important.
Now, that's going to make agriculture output a little bit more efficient on its own, but the big thing that they're counting on is implementing some new agricultural theories, and specifically coming in line with the best ideas of this Soviet guy named Trofim Lysenko. Now, if you want to hear more about Lysenko, I would heavily recommend a Behind the Bastards episode from 2018 done on him. And, in that episode, Robert Evans claims that he is the scientist who's killed more people in the world than anyone else at around 50 million plus. I would actually debate that because I don't really know if you can, in a straight face, call Lukashenko a scientist. To be totally clear on what Lysenko believed, and just to point out, Lysenko was the guy who was in charge of Soviet agriculture for well over a decade. Stalin loved him, Stalin loved his ideas, and everyone who disagreed with him was purged. And so Lysenko was like the tone at the top for the Soviet Union, and China modeled everything they did after the Soviet Union. So Lysenkoism took over in China as well. Basically, Lysenko totally rejected everything that scientists at the time knew about genetics. You may have heard of a guy named Gregor Mendel, the first dude to come up with the idea of the Punnett square and dominant recessive genes, and that guy was an idiot. You may have heard of genes, passed down from one. No, that's not. Genes are fakes. Genes are a lie by the bourgeoisie. No, you know what we can do? If we want crops to survive in winter, what we're going to do is we're going to take the seeds and we're going to soak the seeds in cold water so we can educate the seeds, just like you can educate a person, because, a plant is basically a person, and we're going to make them survive the the winter. You know what we're going to do? People are stronger together, working together, collectively. If we plant crops super close together, like 2 centimeters apart, surely that's going to make them stronger and develop a big, nice root system. They're not going to cannibalize each other and steal nutrients and whatnot. No. Surely plants of the same kind couldn't do that to each other. Now, if you know anything about agriculture and farming at all, or like, for instance, you're like Jay and you live in Indiana, or you're like me and you live in Georgia, and you live in Indiana, right?
No, I'm from Illinois.
Same thing. Anyway, and you've like seen crops. You may know that that's not how that works.
Not quite.
All right, Jay. What's one significant difference between Illinois and Indiana on a practical level?
The presence of Chicago.
We'll table this for later.
Yeah, and the people's communes were tasked not just with increasing their agrarian output, but also contributing to China's industrialization as well.
I love this part.
Yeah, this most famously came through the use of backyard blast furnaces. These would be become famous, or infamous, I should say, as a symbol of the Great Leap Forward.
Oh, I love this part.
Now, these blast furnaces, fueled by coal, wood, or other materials, could in theory be used to smelt steel from iron, and distributed on a mass scale, they would allow for a peasant-led rural industrial revolution, something the world had never seen.
Okay, so just imagine this, like you're just out farming, and one day a dude shows up in a truck with a big furnace, and like maybe they teach you how to use it, but they're just like, all right, make your own steel.
Yeah, and like anybody who's...
And these things are dangerous, right? And
oh yeah,
really require months and years of training to use, and are also done in massive factories collectively. Like
yeah, I mean, if
this is just the most redneck shit. Like, all right, y'all watch this. I'm gonna.
If you've taken any history class on dealing with the Industrial Revolution in Europe or America, you learn that it comes about through these big factories and cities. And Mao's like, well, what if we don't do that? What if we just have everybody do it in their backyard?
So, like, if all right, y'all watch this, I'm gonna make my own girders, works out. Like, let's say hypothetically that first people don't burn their houses down, don't scald themselves, and able to make steel. They're gonna make steel that is like of completely different grades and completely different lengths of units of beams and shit. And it's gonna completely vary in quality and like might not be able to be like grafted or welded together well with other. And remember, anyone who could raise their hand and say, "Hey, Comrade Chairman, this sounds quite moronic," isn't going to do that because they don't want to get shot in the head. And you have other intellectuals and peoples who are in the universities and whatnot doing things like, because Lysenkoism says that inherited diseases are not a thing because traditional inheritance isn't real, just aren't telling people that sickle cell exists.
Yeah.
And are just like pretending it, just not teaching it for 20 years.
Yep. And to get back to the Great Leap Forward, the third part of it were these big infrastructure programs. Constructions of roads and dams were accelerated throughout the country, and in order to make this possible, the Chinese state would come to rely mostly on corvée labor, basically just conscripting farmers into working on these projects.
And the reason that they're doing this, we want to make history entertaining here, but we really want to tell you like why people did things. This is all about, if you want to summarize the Great Leap Forward in one sentence, the people are the power. Utilizing the power of the people. The elites, the bureaucrats, the intellectuals, you can't trust them. You can trust the people that helped Mao win the war, that fed his armies while they were fighting the Japanese, that he won over against the nationalists. And if we can simply motivate the people to achieve the potential that Mao knows they had, then certainly we can get things done. In order to motivate them to reach their potential, we implement what? A massive propaganda plan aimed at getting everyone involved in bettering the country together. And if anybody doesn't like it, well, that's what those struggle sessions are for.
Altogether, the communes were meant to produce both enough for themselves to be self-sufficient, as well as enough surplus for the state to support both the industrial programs that were still going on in the cities, and to even export to foreign countries in exchange for the cash China needed to buy modern equipment.
So, just to elaborate, basically, in a communist system, if you're not aware, like, taxes are still a thing. So, you are expected to make all of the stuff you need, and as far as food and whatnot, and maybe even materials and industrial infrastructure improvements, and then be able to hand over a bunch of your food and whatnot to be used by the state, and the state would then sell it to other nations and, trade, make money and whatnot. Were there was there commerce between different communes, or are they all supposed to act pretty much independently?
In theory, they are supposed to act independently. There would be some things which certain communes just weren't able to produce, and you would have a system of redistributing goods that would be run by the state as opposed to, on the more local level. So a sort of very capitalist-style commerce between people on the local level was being stamped out, essentially.
And of course, it's important to remember that commerce and capitalism are not necessarily the same thing.
Yes.
But another important thing to remember is that, like, in a more ideal communist system, perhaps, everyone would get what they need and then would have taken from them what they can stand to have taken from them. A guy would show up and assess, okay, this is what you got. This is what you need. We're going to take off the difference and we're going to use it to benefit the greater collective.
Yeah, and we'll be talking almost entirely about the communes that were in essentially agrarian areas, because that's where the majority of them were. But there are communes, in the cities who obviously aren't doing farming, or in places of the countryside where, you have mining communities or whatever. So those will obviously rely on food from other parts of the country.
We're about to get into what went wrong, and to me, the biggest problem here, beyond Lysenkoism, beyond, encouraging people to plant in ways that don't make any sense or reorganizing their entire social structures, is that the way they did this taxation is not, we're going to look at and see what you can give. No. We here in Beijing, we're going to do some beep beep boop calculations. We're going to see what you should be producing, and then we're going to determine what you can stand to give, and then we're going to come take it. So let's get into what went wrong.
Now, initial signs in 1958 were promising. The crop yields were up, mostly thanks to particularly good weather. And the program was very popular amongst much of the peasantry, who genuinely bought into the promise of a better future, and who were encouraged by the generous nature of the communal kitchens, generosity brought about by the promise of ever-improving yields.
Big collective action and doing things all together is really exciting and it's fun, but cracks begin to show in the Great Leap Forwards programs pretty early. When people point out that, for instance, Lysenko-based agriculture reforms are really ineffective and wasteful. Like, hey, if we plant all this rice that close together, we're gonna end up wasting a lot of rice. That's to the struggle session with you. When people start actually trying to use these blast furnaces, they start realizing, we don't really have the iron ore to do this. So what are we going to do? Well, we have to we are required to make iron. So, pots, pans, tools, that lady's brooch, throw it all in there. This would obviously start cannibalizing the things that people need to live in the villages. And I am now going to quote from Clayton B. Brown and this huge thing that Jay has pasted into the doc, and I'm going to do it in a very cool, smooth voice. This is from China's Great Leap Forward, originally published by the Association for Asian Studies. At the same time that farmers became the backbone of industrial production, urban cadres made command decisions for the nation's agricultural output to similar effect. They too set unrealistic quotas, but also distributed pamphlets to farmers mandating the use of multiple harvests, overseeding, deep plowing, and over-fertilizing. Although farmers knew better and did not always implement the suggestions, some were compelled to do such things as dig a hole the size of a swimming pool and pour all of their seed grain in expectation of a phenomenal crop, or break up clay pots and work them into the soil. Even though the nutrients had been baked out, ignorance at the center was met by fanatical devotion to Mao's vision and the intense competition amongst communes. If a neighboring commune projected a doubling grain output, then certainly our commune can produce triple. And just as those with the greatest faith were the most read, anyone who questioned even the most unrealistic goals became a rightist. Recalling the consequences of the anti-rightist campaign a year earlier, local leaders felt compelled to meet ridiculous grain quotas at any cost, or more often to falsify their reports. Whether out of ignorance or fear, those in the party's highest ranks tended not to question the exaggerating figures, even when Mao did visit the countryside to investigate. The locals intentionally transplanted crops along his route to give the illusion of widely dense yields. And that's again from Clayton B. Brown. I've even heard people describe China at the time as this giant stage play put on for Mao.
Yeah.
When you heard about people digging swimming pool size gouges in the ground and then pouring all the seeds in, or breaking up clay pots and working the soil, that sounds insane. It was insane, and a lot of people said it was insane at the time. And then again, struggle session for you. Even then, I honestly think a lot of this collective farming effort sounds like a pretty good idea, just to me personally, because I am also a crazy leftist. But if they had set somewhat reasonable expectations, 10% increase, 15% increase, they probably would have been fine. But it's no, you need to make twice as much rice this year as you did the year before, and it should be easy. So you do everything the state tells you to do, even though you think it's insane. You're well, certainly they know better than me, glorious communism, this has never happened before. We're in a new age. We did what we were doing for 3,000 years, and now it's over. The old way is over. Capitalism is wrong. Hierarchy is wrong. It's honestly, in many ways, very logical for people to believe this stuff was going to work because things had changed so much previously. But then suddenly, everything goes wrong, and your yields are even less than they used to be, and they're not doubling, and they're not tripling, and you're starting to remember what's happening to people who are seen as resisting the regime, and you start worrying that if you don't meet your quotas, something's going to happen to you and your kids and your family. So what do? You falsify your reports.
And these positive, but clearly false reports were embraced by Mao. And encouraged by the seeming success of the program, the Chinese government made a series of fateful decisions. Rice and wheat was replaced by cash crops such as cotton and tea in many of the communes. Food exports to foreign countries were increased. And most importantly, the tax rate on the output of the communes was raised from 20 to 28%.
So, you guys are doing so great? Excellent! Well, now you can start making less food, and also we're going to take more of it from you. This is what you told us, right? You said you were doing great. We're just reacting to those signals.
The difference between 20 and 28% might not seem that much, but because the 28% was based on the inflated figures provided by commune leaders, that meant that the communes now had to provide the central government with 28% of their supposed production, not their real production, in order to avoid accusations of fraud. And the result of that was that a far higher share of the crop production in 1959, in some instances nearly the entire harvest of a commune, was taken from the farmers directly to government storehouses.
And that harvest was supposed to feed them.
Yes.
And this starts to pile in on itself. Remember, 58, things are pretty fine because that was a really good year. But 59, the luck starts to run out, and this creates food crises popping up here and there, a commune here, a commune there. And this news of an impending food crisis starts to make its way up the layers of the government. Local leaders, there's only so long you can fake things, and you can't fake it. Oh well, surely the farmers they're hiding grain over there, or the commune next to us, they stole it. They're secretly rightists, and these accusations are excuses that are embraced by Mao, who is not going to believe that his 5-year plan has any errors and that his great leap forward is a great leap off a cliff.
Yeah, the government had these large stores of food collected from the communes, but they refused to distribute it back to them. Food was instead kept in storehouses or exported to foreign countries, and Mao never reached out to said foreign countries for aid.
Most of this is going to the Soviet Union, right?
Yes, the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries.
North Korea and whatnot.
Yeah.
And this means that also farmers are getting intensely overworked in a futile attempt to boost production. Because when you don't meet your quotas, well, then you don't get your rations from the communal kitchen. People get suspected of hoarding food for themselves, their family, and the fact a lot of them probably did a little bit because you don't want your kids to die. And even if it was just a few loaves of bread or a few bags of rice, you get ratted out in the struggle sections, because again, if you rat someone out in the struggle sessions, then it's probably way less likely to get turned on you. And now you're not just getting yelled at, but you're probably also getting subjected to torture and even execution as people get more and more desperate.
Things look similarly bad on the industrial side of the Great Leap Forward. Mao hoped that China's steel production would soon rival that of the United States, but the true output of the backyard furnaces was not nearly high enough for that. And, as you mentioned earlier, the steel produced by these furnaces was actually very low-quality iron most of the time, nearly useless without further refinement. As it turns out, farmers who don't know anything about metallurgy, melting down their farm equipment and cutlery, doesn't provide for a strong foundation for a new industrial revolution.
Do we have any evidence of them trying to build bridges or something out of this steel? Surely this caused at least one big industrial accident.
We will get to a big industrial accident, which I'll mention at the end, though that's not due to this steel. My read of the situation is that when the steel made its way to factories in the cities, the people there basically realized it was mostly useless.
Good on them.
Yeah.
So we're in 59 and 60, and these years the weather is a lot less favorable, and you've got that adding on to excessive collection of crops by the government, and the fact that farmers had to divide their time between farming and producing steel, or working as forced labor. And then there's also the ineffectual new farming methods and the struggle sessions and people turning on each other and the tension, and this all adds up to a massive famine that's going to break out throughout much of the countryside, and is called appropriately the Great Famine, beginning in 1959 and persisting to the end of 1961. Within these disastrous years, tens of millions of Chinese citizens died of starvation. One might know that starvation also makes you far more susceptible to disease, and tens and millions more are going to die from the maladies brought on by malnourishment. This is added on top to the hundreds of thousands that are intentionally killed as enemies of the state. And here's where things get a bit messy, because it is completely and totally true that the amount of people that died, like the physical number, did get exaggerated by many Western and capitalist governments in order to make communism sound worse. You know, when you bring this up, a lot of tankies and communists will say, well, you're just repeating propaganda. To which I will respond, true awful things make great propaganda. But also, we do need to be skeptical about numbers. We always need to ask, like, where do numbers come from? How do we know what we know? Especially when what we know is very convenient to the people in power. Whenever something's convenient to the people in power, you should always have, like, an extra little skeptical thing next to your head. So, Jay, where do these numbers exactly come from, and what's sort of the ranges we got here?
Now, one of the methods that academics use to try to figure out how many people died is to look at census data from before and after the Great Leap Forward. We don't actually have any data from the years immediately during or after the Great Leap Forward. However, by using basically, algorithms to track the expected rate of population growth, if everything was proceeding as normal, and looking at the actual figures for population comparing the 1950s and late 1960s, you can try to work backwards to see how many excess deaths occurred. And later academics would also, particularly ones in China, have access to at least some government documents from local level, documents that had been kept by the communes and still existed. And they could also use those to try to figure out how many people died. The end result is that the lowest estimates that are seen as credible are around 15 million deaths, while you have the highest estimates being around 40 million. Most figures I've seen fall between 20 and 30 million, which are easily enough to make it the deadliest famine of the 20th century and give it a higher death toll than the entire First World War.
So basically, if you want to take the most charitable view of what happened, the Chinese Communist Party ended up getting killed 15 million people, more than, that's 10 times more than, for instance, every American casualty in a war ever.
Yeah.
This is a level of tragedy that I'm just going to tell you, I can't comprehend it. I can't wrap my mind around it. I don't know what this looks like. This probably means whole villages wiped off the map, ghost towns, emaciated children. It's hard to even question it, which is why it's really easy for people to say, oh, that didn't necessarily happen or wasn't necessarily that bad, because, like, this is the kind of thing that sort of breaks the human brain, right? Like, we were never built to comprehend numbers this large or grapple with this kind of ramifications.
Yeah, I read a brief excerpt from an interview with a member of the official in the Communist Party, who was around during the Great Leap Forward, and he was talking about he would go from villages to villages and see hundreds of bodies piled up. And, afterwards he would hear stories of people saying that the dogs were eating the bodies. And he said, oh, no, that's not true.
Cross.
Yeah, and he said, that's not true. The dogs weren't eating bodies because the people ate the dogs long ago.
Yep. So we just said there's a lot of historical debate on how bad this was. Obviously, it's bad. It's just how bad. And another big part of the historical debate is Mao's culpability. Some say this is an intentional massacre of his own people being carried out according to plan. I, by the way, don't believe that. Never attribute to malice what you can attribute to stupidity. Others portray it as unintentional but highly costly error. I'm definitely in that camp. Jay, you got a take on it?
Yeah, the consensus is that Mao did not truly set out to kill millions of his own people, but rather his staunch beliefs and tendency to view legitimate criticism as a sign of treachery towards himself, and to just not believe in, negative reports, stopped him from taking the actions that could have saved tens of millions of lives.
This is the consequence of really two things I'm seeing. One, giving a person who is really, really good at one thing, but not really good at another thing, placing him in charge of that other thing. And 2, ego. An ego that most military leaders are going to have.
Yeah. While Mao remained in a state of denial during the famine, many members of the Communist Party and government realized that things had to change. The defense minister, Marshal Peng Dehuai, actually brought his concerns over the program to Mao in 1959, but was fired from his post for doing so, with most of his supporters subsequently purged from the military.
By 1962, though, even the most dedicated Mao supporters they were calling it quits. So you have this meeting of the Communist Party known as the 7,000 Cadres Conference. That's a name. It takes place from January to February of that year, during which time the chairman of the People's Republic, Liu Shaoqi, and the deputy premier, Deng Xiaoping, and other key figures of the government, many of whom are from the same group of old revolutionaries as Mao and would thus have that kind of legitimacy. They upheld the first guy, Peng, the stuff that he brought up in 1959. They uphold his criticisms before. They denounce a bunch of his policies, and they effectively sideline Mao from power, though they did not go as far to formally remove him from various offices. So it would be fair to say that, like, the people still think that Mao's in charge, and, like, his name's on all, like, the forms and statues and whatnot,
he's
but he's not...
He's still the chairman.
Yeah, but he's not making any decisions.
Yeah. The famine was brought to a close as the government reduced taxation, opened its food stores, and reversed many of the policies of the Great Leap. The people's communes would continue to exist as units of administration until the 80s, but with greatly relaxed guidelines and objectives.
This would result in significantly diminished reputation for Mao amongst the elites of the party. Remember, propaganda is still getting pumped out to the peasants on the ground all the time, but everyone in charge recognized that while he made great feats as a military leader, he's prickly, he's prone to eccentricities. He's not a guy to talk about farming. I don't think he's ever farmed in his life. They did not share his idea of continuous revolutionary struggle, instead preferred to develop China into a more normal state, member of the international community. The power struggle between these realists and Mao's more ideologically driven faction would resume just a few years later with the Cultural Revolution, possibly another podcast topic, but ultimately it would be the realists who came out on top.
In the cruel epilogue to this story, the deaths inflicted by the Great Leap Forward would not end in 1962. Indeed, a decade later, in 1975, Typhoon Nina would hit mainland China and cause many of the dams built during the Great Leap Forward to collapse. The resulting flooding killed between 85 and 200,000 people, making it one of the largest natural disasters in Chinese history.
During the story, I keep over and over thinking about playing Civilization 5. I used to be really into that game and a few others that allows you to build up your own simulated country. You focus on increasing the numbers, more food, more money, more production. And if you do this in a nation, this results in more happiness, less poverty, less death. It's a noble goal. Maybe it's a thing that you even should do. But when you look at people being expected to triple rice yields by implementing pseudoscience, the Great Leap Forward looks more and more like an exercise of Mao's delusional ego. An ego maintained by fake farm trips and doctored propaganda photos. All while 30 million people, brothers, daughters, children, storytellers, poets, leaders, craftsmen, lovers, watched each other die. A population double the size of the state I live in. Gone. For whims.
Yeah, well, if you enjoy this content, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to us on YouTube. Rate us highly on Spotify.
Why does anyone
Apple.
like this, Jay?
Hopefully, someone. Who knows? We gotta get the tankies on board with us.
I can't. Oh, Jay, don't bully the Rose Twitter people again. They have enough problems, okay? Without you messing them up.
They can take it. Probably not.
We're all trying to make it through this. Like, I don't know. I want to learn things, and I think people are bad. So I made a podcast about people being bad, and now we wound up here. We also wound up with an email. NoOneIsCompetent@gmail.com. If you want to ask us things, if you want to inquire about certain things, if you want to ask us where to mail your mail bombs. If you want to... Hey, here's actually a thing I want to know. It'll be a while before we can implement this because we kind of got a queue. But what do you want us to cover on the podcast? Currently, we're trying to sort of do a diverse spread of things. We're trying to do ancient stuff, modern stuff. Later, I want to cover more economic, and we haven't really done corporate disasters yet. But I swear we're gonna work that in soon. I don't know. Jay, what the hell do you want this podcast to be?
Just... It's a good question. I haven't really thought about that. Which I suppose is the best sign for somebody making a podcast and not exactly
One thing you'll learn about both me and Jay is that we are some of the smartest and stupidest people you will ever meet. Someone who's not stupid is the legendary Sam Bryce, who does our music. And a sheer sign of your intelligence is if you rate us on the social media, review us. We are at NoOneIsCompetent on Twitter. Jay, if this podcast ever takes off, we're going to have to make a Facebook page for it. That's going to be a hassle. I've never been on Facebook. By the way, there's going to be so many podcast episodes about Facebook. Y'all don't even know. We're kind of waiting for all of the congressional testimonies and shit to simmer down, but Mark
Zuckerberg will get his time to shine here.
5-hour episode on Mark Zuckerberg. The other day, I'm at my work, and the guy who comes in to fix the machines he's 45 or some shit, and Gen Xer, and he was just we were talking about insomnia, and he was just you listen to Jordan Peterson, right? He has that problem. And I just think to myself, there is no escape. There is no escape from the online. This is my life now.
This is the praxis that we all live in.
Before we go, on a personal level, I want to say that I actually have recently decided to quit that job that I worked in. I worked as a man. I said I worked as a manager in customer service, but I ran a laundromat in the town that I live in. It was actually the highest rated laundromat in town, and I was, I guess, mildly proud of that. But I am Jay. You know this, but I have had some serious mental health problems recently. I won't go too into it because I know most of y'all aren't really invested enough in our narratives to care. But and if you're at the end of the podcast, some slow roll panic attacks, hard time getting out of bed, some paralyzing brain fog. You know the stuff. I'm reorienting a lot of my life around content creation, doing what I love. I'm trying to get a new job in which I kind of only work the amount of time that I need to work and not sort of chasing money just for the sake of itself. And the money wasn't even that good. But I've been really throwing myself into this podcast, and as I am now soon to be unemployed and regulating my own days, a big thing that's going to keep me from slipping into a sort of dirge of endless meh lying on the couch is routine, is regularity, and a big part of that is putting out this podcast every 2 weeks. I didn't think it would work. Sometimes I am holy shit, Jay actually did this. We and he agreed to do it. I tricked him into doing it, and we did it, and we're on episode 7 now, and that's a small accomplishment. There are podcasts of episodes in 700s, but it lets me know that I can build things. And even as a lot of my life has just in the past 2 weeks sort of crumbled into dust, that there will be plenty of things to work on in the future. And just know that whenever you listen, I do appreciate it because I take a lot of pride in this. Jay works incredibly hard on this. And this is kind of, to us, like one of the things that we make that really like expresses who we are, like outside of someone paying us to do it, or like our jobs or college, or like a professor assigns you something. This is what we like doing, and we plan to get better at it and flourish in it, and eventually develop, show off mastery over it. Am I rambling, Jay?
I mean, yes, but I don't think you're wrong to do so in this situation. This is something which, like going in, I also, if you asked me a year ago, would I be 7 episodes into making a podcast? I would say probably not. So yeah, it's definitely cool that we've managed to pull this off so far, and I have enjoyed making these.
Watch this be the last episode. Like everything turns into a train wreck afterwards. Okay, I guess this one ended up being kind of shorter compared to the other ones, which is why I was allowed to go on a massive rant. There's no. Wait. What's the next episode going to be on? Drum roll, 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 drum roll.
The hunt for none other than a certain Osama bin Laden.
Yes, we are picking up the Afghan war saga with the hunt for Osama bin Laden. Why did it take 11 years to get him? Why is the U.S. bad at doing stuff? See, we also talk about the U.S. being bad at stuff. That's what's happening next time. So, I want to do the outro this time like I'm like this is like a PBS show, and I'm like waving bye to the kids on the other side of the camera. So, bye, guys. Jay, do a big bye. Bye.
Bye.
Fuck you, man. I love you so much.